I was thinking about this the other day. The more you mature in life, you begin to change your perspective on things. When we are young, there are certain things that we value that as we grow and as we live life, we look back and we say, those things that I invested so much time in do not really matter. I wish I had given more time to other things. I'm a pastor and I get to see people die. Unfortunately, that's the hard part of my job, is that when people are dying, they invite you in to pray with them, to pray with their loved ones. And in all the times that I've sat down with someone at the end of their life, I've never heard from any one of them, Pastor, I have some regrets. I wish I had worked harder. I wish I had built a bigger company. I wish I had made more money. I've never heard anyone express regrets in these ways. It's usually, I wish I had given more to others. I wish I had given more time to my family. I wish I had invested more in relationships. Depending on where you are in life, you know that your perspective has changed and is changing, and it will change. The letter that we're going to read from today is a letter that the Apostle Peter writes to a persecuted church in the region of what we know today as modern-day Turkey. These were Christians living about 2 to 3 decades after the death and resurrection of Jesus. And they were facing many difficulties. They were being persecuted for their faith. Some of us Christians today, we say, we're persecuted for our faith. It's nothing compared to how Christians were persecuted for their faiths back then. They were being boycotted from businesses. Many of them were arrested. Some of them were being killed by the fact that they professed faith in Jesus. And so it's in that suffering, it's in this distress that the Apostle Peter writes this letter to them. They're looking at their lives being torn to shreds. And the Apostle Peter writes something to them in order to change their perspective of that suffering, to change their perspective of what they were going through, so that they would understand what God was doing in a greater scale and how they fit that work that God was performing amongst them. And so we find ourselves today in 1 Peter chapter 2. This is the context by which we read these words. 1 Peter chapter 2, we're going to read verses 4 through 12. This is what Peter writes to a suffering church. He's saying to them, as you come to him, a living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious. You yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. So the honor is for you who believe, but for those who do not believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. They stumble because they disobey the word as they were destined to. But you, this word is for you. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your souls. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. This is the word of the Lord. Even though the Apostle Peter wrote it, we believe that these are the words of God, not just for that people, but to us as his people today. What is the Apostle Paul offering to these early Christians and to us as well as a new perspective about what God is doing in the world and how we fit in his work? Three things I want to focus on with you this morning. First, that he's saying we are being built. What is God doing? He is building us. Secondly, it's about purpose. We are being built for a purpose. You are being built, but you are being built for a purpose. And then lastly, the question that we should all ask, how do we live in this purpose that God has established for us? So you are being built, we are being built, you are being built for a purpose, we are being built for a purpose, and how do we live in that purpose? First, he encourages them by saying, we are being built. And that is an encouraging word immediately to them that hear these words that were read to them by someone, as the Apostle Paul had written this letter, and that letter had arrived at that destination, which was those Christians in Asia Minor in their gathering. When they first heard these words, they meant to encourage them because they were believing that they were being torn apart, shred to pieces. And the Apostle Peter says, hey, listen, you are not being shred to pieces. You are not being torn apart. Even though you're suffering much for the sake of Jesus, what's actually happening is you are partaking in the work of God. He is not allowing you to be shred to pieces, but he is actually building you up. Look at verse 5 once again. He says to them, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house. Not only are you being built up and not being shred to pieces, but you are being built up as a spiritual house. Now, I think that sometimes we go through words in Scripture and we don't fully understand what they mean. What does the Apostle Peter mean when he says to these early Christians that they're being built up as a spiritual house? To them, they understood it as the temple that was back in Jerusalem. Remember, these are Jewish Christians living in Asia Minor, dispersed. That's how he started off the letter, to my brothers and sisters dispersed in Asia Minor. He is writing to Christians who were living in Turkey, but who had their faith rooted in Jerusalem where there was the temple. The temple was the place where heaven and earth converged. It was the place where God brought his glory down to meet the people. The glory of God inhabited the temple in Jerusalem. The Shekinah glory of God inhabited that place. That was their place of worship. And so as you can imagine, for those who heard this for the very first time, it was a bit confusing because Peter is saying to them, God is building a spiritual house with you. But here they are living in Turkey and the temple is still back in Jerusalem. What are they saying? Are you saying, Peter, that God is building a new temple? We have a temple. Why is there a need to build another one? And if you went to the temple back then, when the Apostle Peter writes this in 65 AD, remember, he writes this in 65 AD, you would go to Jerusalem and you would find this amazing edification there, the temple that Herod had built. This is the third version of the temple. Solomon built the first version. It was destroyed. They rebuilt it. It was not anywhere like the glory of the first temple because they didn't have the resources to rebuild it. And then Herod, the king that was appointed by the Romans, comes in. He was a builder. He was known as a historic builder, and he builds this amazing temple. If you were to go to Jerusalem today, there's this museum that you would find this prototype of the city of Jerusalem back in the days that the Apostle Peter writes this letter to the church. And as you can notice, it was an amazing edification. To this day, you see the size of the rocks that are there. And it took pretty much, right? This is a miniature prototype of the city back then. It was almost like a fifth of the whole city of Jerusalem. It was one of the wonders of the world back in those days. Who could tear a temple like this down? Like, made of stones, big stones. And so Peter is saying, you are being built up as a spiritual house. They're like, well, we already have a spiritual house. But Peter is saying, hey, but this spiritual house that God is building is very unique. And in fact, this is a greater spiritual house than the one that you know in Jerusalem. Now, you know what's interesting? I don't know if you have read this in history. Remember, when does Peter write this? 65 AD, if you're paying attention. 5 years later, the Romans came in and destroyed the city of Jerusalem. Only 5 years later, in 70 AD, they destroyed it, and they destroyed this temple. And they didn't leave stone over stone. You go there to this day, you'll see. They completely destroyed the temple. Jesus had spoken about that in Matthew 24 and the discourse that he gives in the Mount of Olives, that these things would happen. And the reason why Peter is already talking about the new temple is because this temple has already become obsolete, and God needs a new house for the mission that he has to accomplish through his people in the world. And Peter is saying, you have no idea how better this new temple that God is building compared to the one that you know. Number one, this is a temple built by God. All the other temples were not built by God. It was built by men. Solomon built one. Nehemiah and Ezra restored it. And Herod built another one. This temple now is unique. It's better. Its glory does not compare because it's being built by God. Number two, it's built on a solid foundation. It's an unshakable foundation that no one can destroy. Look at what he says in verse 4, which was the very first verse that we read. As you come to him, the living stone rejected by men in the sight of God, chosen and precious. To which later on he says that living stone chosen by God, it has become the cornerstone, verse 7. What is he saying? This foundation that God is building this new house is being built on the person of Jesus. You can destroy temples made by the hands of men, but you cannot destroy the temple that's been built by the hands of God, on whom God himself and Jesus Christ is the foundation. And on top of that, not only is this temple built by God, not only is this temple built in a solid foundation that no one can wipe out. How many people, how many cultures have tried to wipe out Christianity from the map in the last 2,000 years? Have they been successful? No. The more they persecute and kill Christians, the more Christianity spreads. One father of the early church, a man by the name of Tertullian, used to say this: the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And it will continue to be built because it's not built with stones, it's built with lives, it's built with people. You yourselves, like living stones, are being built up. That's what he says. That's why this temple is unique. And you know what's amazing about this is that this is who we are. See, the words that Peter writes to these early Christians saying, hey, listen, there's something unique here. You don't have to feel far from God just because you're living in Asia Minor while the temple and where the glory of God dwells is in Jerusalem, because now you take the temple where you are. You are the new temple. The minute that you come to faith in Jesus, any one of you here, the presence of God that used to inhabit this temple in Jerusalem now inhabits you, now inhabits us. We take the presence of God wherever we go. It's not limited to a geographic area anymore. It's not limited to four walls anymore. The presence of God is with us. It's in us. And he is building this house with our lives, which means this: you are living stones. You have a unique role to play in the building up. It's still being built. That's what he says. It's still being built. You play a significant role. You are a living stone. Now, some stones, think about this, in a temple were closer to the door or the door walls, which means maybe you're helping people to come in through the doors of the church. Some are closer to the altar. Maybe you're helping to lead people into worship. Some stones are laid out in the courtyard. Maybe you have a ministry to the community. But regardless, God has wired you uniquely, and He has called you with a purpose to help build up His church. You are this church. He has gifted you in a unique way. There's hands that only you can hold. There's tears that only you can dry. There's lives that only you can touch. You are this new temple where the glory of God dwells and inhabits. And I think this is a very important thing for us to realize and for us to capture. Like, we need to embody this vision. Because if we don't embody this vision, what will happen? Jesus will not be our foundation. The church will become about something else other than Jesus. And unfortunately, there are expressions of the church in the world today where Jesus is not the main thing. It's about other things. Maybe it's about entertainment. Maybe it's about self-help. Maybe it's about politics. It's no longer about Jesus. If you, not just me, if you yourselves don't embody this vision that I am the new temple of God and I am a living stone in this temple, if you don't embody this, Jesus will not be our foundation. You will still be under the control and the fangs of religion. What happens when you're still under the powers of religion? Because religion tells you this: hey, listen, in the temple of God, there are professional people known as priests. And you begin to depend on the priests for every single work that God does in the world. The Apostle Peter is trying to break that paradigm for them and say, hey, listen, we are in a new dispensation. This is a new season. This is a new reality. Don't wait on the professional class to do the work. You are a priest as well. When you don't embody this vision, you become a prey to our cultural narratives. And one of them that's very dangerous is the narrative of individualism. That you have a relationship with God that's singular and not plural, and you don't need the church. You don't need the body of Christ. How many of you have friends, how many of you have thought this before, that I can just have my relationship with God? I don't like organized religion. That's the quote. You heard this before? I mean, I heard it many times. A brick, a living stone, by itself dies. It only finds its purpose when it's built together with the other ones, forming this spiritual house that God has called us to be. God is not interested so much in physical buildings as He is interested in a spiritual house. Where does the holiness of God inhabit? It's not in this building. The holiness of God is not in these walls. The holiness of God is in our gathering. The walls are important for us to have the gathering, but this is not a holy place. You are the holy place of God. This is what the Apostle Peter is writing to them and saying, this is the type of life that we've been called to live, to embody the glory of Jesus, the presence of Jesus, to dwell in and among us, and to continue to build up so others can find a shelter and experience the glory of God among us. You get the picture? You were being built with a purpose. What is the purpose? Look at there in verse 3. Let's go to verse 3. In verse 5, he says, you yourself, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house. Now look, the second part is key. To be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. I said it before and I'll say it again. Because of Jesus, all of us have been made priests. What was the role of a priest back then? The role of a priest in the temple, in every religion, not just in Judaism, the role of the priest was to mediate the relationship between God and the people. The priests would take on themselves the burden of the people, and they would bring it up to God. And they would offer sacrifices, animal sacrifices, on behalf of the sins of the people, so that the people could have their sins atoned. And once the sacrifices were offered, they represented God back to the people, and they said to the people, "You have found mercy in God because your sacrifice was acceptable to him. You have your sins forgiven." They were mediators between the people and God and the people. And they offered acceptable sacrifices to God. And what Peter is now saying to them is like, all of you are called to serve as priests. How so? To offer sacrifices that are acceptable to God. Spiritual sacrifices. Now it's the key. It's no longer bloody sacrifices, no longer physical sacrifices, but spiritual sacrifices. You were called to step in to this mantle that God has given you, which is to become a priest. We are all priests in Jesus. Why is it that in our church you don't go and confess to a priest? Because you can go directly to Jesus. You don't need a mediator. You are now a new mediator. And then people say, well, then, Pastor, what are you doing up on stage? Why does the church have to pay you a salary? Because my job is to equip you so that you can fully live your calling, which is to be a priest. It's to equip and form new priests so that you can live in your priesthood. And if I am not equipping you for you to do the work of a priest, I am overburdening myself, number one, and I'm not doing my job. And so that's why we come to church every Sunday, is to be equipped so that we can live this life of priesthood that we're all called to live in. Does that make sense? See, this is a new perspective. That's what I'm saying. This is a new paradigm that we must all understand. How do I apply this today? Let's be very practical. Remember, the priest is a mediator. He offers sacrifice on behalf of the people. He represents the people to God and God to the people. What is your job? How do you live within this? Before that question, what do you do as priests? You bring people to God. You look at the people that God has placed in your life, in your neighborhood, in your workspace, your church, and you take on their burdens, their pain. And you take it to God and you pray for them. You intercede for them. Another way you do that by bringing people to God is you invite people to church. You invite people into the presence of God. What is the presence of God? The gathering of the people of God. If we're gathering at the beach, that's the presence of God. If we're gathering in someone's home for a community group, that's the presence of God. If we're gathering together to serve in the inner cities, we take the presence of God there. And when you bring people to these gatherings, you're bringing them before God. You're bringing them into the presence of God. Like, all of us should be very intentional about inviting people to come to church or to be with the people of God, the church. Are you intentional about that? Many of you are secret agents of God. Nobody knows that you are a follower of Jesus. You're in God's CIA. Jesus is saying, there's no CIA here with me. Everyone's a social worker out publicly in the streets. Who are you inviting next week to be at church? Who are you inviting to serve with you? Who are you inviting to come to community group with you? Who are you inviting? Who are you bringing into the presence of God? You are a priest. Oh, pastor, call this person for me and invite them to church. No, I'm not going to do that. A lot of people do that. Pastor, I have a friend. If you invite them to church, they will come. So why are they not coming when you invite? Well, you just have more power when you do that. What are you saying about yourself and the way in which you're living your Christian life around them? They should be amazed at the life that you live. Let's establish that first. But don't depend on me to live out your calling as a priest. You do that yourself. So you take people to God, but also you take God to people. That's the other thing too. How do I take God to people? I take my faith and I bring my faith to my workspace. I take my faith and I bring my faith into my neighborhood. I take my faith and I bring my faith into my marriage. I take my faith and I bring my faith to my school campus. I don't keep things separated wherever I go. Remember, the presence of God is with me. I take God to people wherever I go. I don't leave it home. I don't leave that at church on Sundays. I bring it with me wherever I go. I take God to people. I live the life of God. The words that I speak are the words of God to them. The hands that I extend to others, it's the hand of God being extended to them. The shoulder that I offer to someone is God's shoulder offered to them when they are weary and in pain and suffering and crying. I take God wherever I go because I'm a priest. When you say this morning, I am a priest. Look at the neighbor. Your neighbor right now says, I'm a priest. You look at them now, you say, you're a priest. Now say these two other things. I take people to God. Say that. And say the second thing, I take God to people. That's who I am. That's my purpose. How are you doing with that? And you're thinking here today, Pastor, I'm encouraged by this, but I don't know how to find the power to do that. It's so hard. I understand. It's not easy. How do I live in this purpose? There's 4 critical and very practical ways for you to do that. Let's go through them real quickly. First, you must make him your cornerstone. Verse 4, which was the very first verse that we read, reads this way, as you come to him, it's as you come to him, the living stone rejected by men. As you come to him. Who is Jesus? The cornerstone. Can I say something to you? If Jesus is not the cornerstone of your life, something else is. And you know why it's important for us to understand this piece of truth? Because the cornerstone was the stone by which all the angles of the building came out of. If the cornerstone was imperfect or corrupted, the building was not going to be a solid building. It was the main stone by which you started everything else. And what the Apostle Peter is saying to them is, as you come to him, you make Jesus what your cornerstone. Is Jesus the foundation of your life? Is he the one that determines the direction of everything in your life? Unfortunately, many of us cannot say that because the cornerstone of our lives is our work. The cornerstone of our lives is our children. The cornerstone of our lives is our money. The cornerstones of our lives is our education. That's the cornerstone of your life. And the Apostle Peter is in essence saying that anything that you put as a cornerstone in your life will build a foundation that will be compromised. Your life will be crooked because nothing can take on the role of Jesus. Only Jesus will guarantee a solid foundation for your life. What's the cornerstone of your life? You need to ask that question. You need to be honest about it. And you need to make Jesus your cornerstone. Secondly, you have to stop building your own kingdom. Now, I love what he says. I don't know if you paid attention to one of the last couple verses, verse 11. He says this, beloved. Let's go back there and say, beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. What is Peter acknowledging and recognizing? That we have a system in this world. There's a competing kingdom in this world with the kingdom of Jesus. That every day when we turn on the TV or when we log into our social media accounts, we are encouraged to live for the kingdom of this world, which is a kingdom that encourages us to build our own kingdoms, build our own empires. You, on a daily basis, are being encouraged to build your own life. This is what the Apostle Peter calls the passions of the flesh. You're building a kingdom for more comfort. You're building a kingdom so your name could last. You're building a kingdom so that you will have a larger platform. And Peter is acknowledging that you will not make Jesus your cornerstone unless you acknowledge that you have embarked in this enterprise that is building a subversive kingdom to the kingdom of Jesus, and you have to stop doing that. Now, there's nothing wrong for you to want to grow in your career. There's nothing wrong for you to have a healthier financial life or to have a great family, build great children, raise great children. There's nothing wrong with that, but that can't come before laying Jesus as the foundation of your life. that can't come without the main impetus of raising children, for instance, for the kingdom of Jesus. Is that how you raise your children? Well, look, I just speak about this because you have a lot of parents here. We raise our children for our kingdoms, for our names, to make ourselves look good. We don't raise our children thinking, I'm going to populate this earth with citizens of heaven. I want my kingdom to be set aside and the kingdom of Jesus to move forward and to grow. And we have to do that and ask that question with every single area of life. What is the kingdom that you need to put down so that Jesus' kingdom can be built up in your life? You will not be a living stone in this new edification that God is building, known as the church, unless you do that. Thirdly, you must give yourself to community. You can't do this alone. Like I said, a brick by itself is not a building. It has to be stacked on others. And it has to be able to carry the weight of other bricks. That's a picture of the church. You have to give yourselves to the church. This kind of Christianity that's being preached to you that you don't need the church is a complete lie. It's not in Jesus' design. You cannot be a Christian by yourself. You have to give yourself to community. And lastly, you must focus on the finished work of Christ for the unfinished work that he is doing in you. He says, once you were not a people, now you are a people. Once you had not received mercy, now you have encountered mercy. The power really lies in us on a daily basis, relying on the mercy of Jesus. Knowing that I fail and you fail on this work on a constant basis, but because there is mercy, Jesus can still utilize you and I to build his house, his spiritual house. It's when you are in touch with this grace and this mercy that Jesus, who was the cornerstone that became rejected by men, became the solid foundation for the church. On the cross, Jesus was what? Rejected. On the cross, Jesus was torn to pieces so that we can be accepted and be built up as a spiritual house. And that's why we come to the communion table this morning. The communion table that we come to on a monthly basis is a reminder of this reality, because it's this table that reminds us that Jesus was the one that was actually torn to pieces. He says, this is my body broken for you, so that you can be built up as a people. I was rejected so that you could be accepted. And because the cross happened and the cross took place, the way to the Father was completely opened so that all of us could enter the presence of God with our flaws, with our shortcomings, marred by our sin. We could come and be fed. This meal is used by Jesus as cement for ourselves. You know how you need like cement to put stones together? This meal serves as that. Because when we all separate bricks come to this table, we are united in the sense and in the belief that we are sinners brought together by the grace of God, being built and put together as a spiritual household for God. This meal reminds us that we are loved and that we have a purpose. Let me invite our ushers forward, our leaders, deacons and elders. And they're going to take these plates and put it before you. And as soon as you are ready, you can come and eat from this meal. It goes all the way back to the experience that Jesus had with his disciples the night that he was betrayed. When he took the bread, as I said, this is my body broken for you. And after taking the bread, he takes the cup and he says, this is the cup of the new covenant. This is my blood spilled for you. I want you to eat it and drink it. And I want you to do this in remembrance of me. Every time that you and I come to this table and we are partaking of these elements, we are reminded of his great love for us, of how he has repurposed our lives for his sake. And therefore, we are always called to do this in memory of him. And that's why we are here. So as soon as you're ready, you can come and taste and see of the goodness of God. Take on this cement that binds us together. No one that comes to the table comes thinking that they're better than the other because they know that Jesus had to die for them. They were so sinful that he had to die for them. But God is so loving that he was glad. He was glad. He was glad to die for them. And so here at the table, we all have the same worth. And it's a great worth because it cost the life of our Lord.